Did I do the right thing? What would you have done? These two questions are the pivotal theme of Simon Wiesenthal's book, The Sunflower, The Possibilities and Limits of Forgiveness. He tells the story and then invites 53 distinguished men and women to respond to those two questions. The 53 comprise theologians, political leaders, writers, jurists, psychiatrists, human rights activists, and victims of attempted genocide in Bosnia, Cambodia, China, and Tibet. They all approach the questions differently, and they challenge us to define our beliefs about justice, compassion, and human responsibility. I would like to share some of them with you. My aim is to be descriptive, not prescriptive. The responses, I think, speak for themselves. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Buddhists throughout the world, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, both advocated forgiveness. Forgiveness, whatever the crime. The Dalai Lama spoke of his Tibetan people's persecution by Chinese authorities and said, "It would be easy to become angry at these tragic events and atrocities. Labelling the Chinese as our enemies, we could self-righteously condemn them for their brutality and dismiss them as unworthy of further thought and consideration. But that is not our Buddhist way." Archbishop Tutu spoke of the magnificence of his former South African president, Nelson Mandela, who was incarcerated for 27 years. His eyesight failed through enforced work in a quarry, his family harassed by the state security police. Tutu said, "By rights, he should be consumed by bitterness and a lust for revenge." The world watched with awe when he so magnanimously invited his white jailer to his inauguration as South Africa's first democratically elected president. "I could tell," Archbishop Tutu says, "of others, both black and white and less well known, who, if asked, 'What would you have done?' would have done the same. They would have forgiven. Forgiveness is not some nebulous thing. It is practical politics. Without forgiveness, there is no future." Other contributors, interestingly, were not so praiseworthy of this thing we call forgiveness. The eminent Jewish writer Cynthia Osnick says to us, "Whoever is merciful to the cruel will end up by being indifferent to the innocent." Forgiveness, she says, can brutalize. Whoever is merciful to the cruel will end by being indifferent to the innocent. We may object, she says, by saying that forgiveness does not condone or excuse. It allows for redemption, for a fresh start, a clean slate. It encourages beginning again. Forgiveness, we may say, permits renewal, but only if there is a next time, she says. "I forgive you," we say to a child who has muddied the carpet, but next time, do not do it again. Forgiveness has enlarging capacities. It will have taught us something. Forgiveness is an effective teacher. Meanwhile, the spots can be washed away. But murder, she says, is irrevocable. With murder, there is no next time. Even if forgiveness restrained a person from perpetrating a new batch of corpses, the last batch will never come alive again. There are, Cynthia Osnick says, some spots forgiveness cannot wash out. Forgiveness which permits redemption can only apply to a condition that is capable of redemption. Forgiveness, she says, is pitiless. It forgets the victim. It negates the right of the victim to his own life. It blurs over suffering and death. It drowns the past. It cultivates sensitivity towards the murderer at the price of insensitivity towards the victim. Martin Marty, a professor of comparative religion at the University of Chicago, speaks of cheap grace. He says, "Is there any kind of situation in which the offence is so gross and enormous that I should withhold forgiveness in the face of what appears to be true penitence? My answer," he says, "would be that in every circumstance that I can picture, more value would grow out of forgiveness than out of its withholding. But I must ask what I am afraid about, what I'm concerned about, and what it is that causes me to hem and hedge, to shuffle and clear my throat, and to be suspicious of that answer I just gave you." He starts to answer his question. Firstly, I'm afraid of cheap grace. Simon Wiesenthal's silence in that army hospital was a guard against the cheapening of grace. A second fear is that crimes against a people will be taken less seriously if individual persons start forgiving in their name. And a third reason is, if grace be cheap and splattered at random, will we not soon forget to tell the story? We do not want a cheap grace, a casual people, or a forgotten victim. What do we want? I'm in search of a grace in the world, he says. As a Christian, I'm told that God is a gracious other, but I also need to be a brother. Gracelessness helps produce totalitarians, but so too might a grace that is cheap. Rabbi Harold Kushner explores the idea of forgiveness as grace, as an undeserved gift. He says, "I'm not sure there is such a thing as forgiving another person, though I know that there's such a thing as being forgiven. To be forgiven is to feel the weight of the past lifted from our shoulders, to feel the stain of past wrongdoing washed away. To be forgiven is to feel free to step into the future, unburdened by the precedent of who we have been and what we have done in previous times. To be forgiven is a miracle. It comes from God, and it comes when God chooses to grant it, not when we order it up. Forgiving is not what we do for another person, as the Nazi asked Wiesenthal to do for him. For a Jew to forgive a Nazi would not mean, God forbid, saying, 'What you did was understandable, I can understand what led you to do it, and I don't hate you for it.' It would instead mean saying, 'What you did was thoroughly despicable and puts you outside the category of decent human beings. But I refuse to give you the power to define me as a victim. I refuse to let your blind hatred define the shape and content of my Jewishness. I don't hate you, I reject you.' And then the Nazi would remain chained to his past and his conscience, but the Jew would walk free."